Good afternoon, colleagues. The purpose of the series is to share the experiences advancing methodological discussions around qualitative research in African settings, and more importantly, networking and supporting qualitative researchers, both locally, internationally, and globally. We will jump into to the first presentation, which will be tabled and delivered by Dr. Sonia Klingberg, who's a postdoc research fellow at DPHRU, which is the Business Development Pathways to Health Research Unit.
So I'm a qualitative researcher, and I've used thematic analysis approaches in a few different ways in my work. So that's what I'll be talking about today. And in particular, I'll be focusing on reflexive thematic analysis. What I hope to achieve with this presentation is to introduce reflexive thematic analysis as a novice-friendly or beginner-friendly option for analyzing qualitative data. So firstly, we should find out what reflexive thematic analysis is and some basics around how to do it. It's an approach to qualitative analysis developed by Virginia Brown and Victoria Clark. Initially, it was just called thematic analysis, but they later renamed it to reflexive thematic analysis to distinguish it from other types of thematic analysis. So I do want to highlight there are plenty of other forms of thematic analysis as well. This approach was originally published as an approach to qualitative psychology research. So that was the 2006 paper. But it's not actually limited to psychology research, and it's been used widely across topics and disciplines. The main phases that it consists of are these 6 that are described here. So firstly, familiarization with the data. That could start with data collection, if the same person who's analyzing the data is the one collecting the data. But if not, then it would start with things like listening to recordings or reading transcripts of maybe interviews or focus group discussions. Depending on what kind of data we're using. It could also be something like posts from online discussion forums, and those have been used in thematic analysis as well. Then after that comes coding, which I've explained here as labeling data. So for example, you'd be highlighting parts either manually or using qualitative analysis software to help you. So highlighting parts of transcripts, using sticky notes or different labels and highlighters. So you would want to be focusing on relevant aspects of the data, and that would obviously depend on the kind of research question and focus that you're working with. And also it would depend on your approach to analysis. Then after that, generating initial themes based on the codings that you could collate or group follows, and creates kind of drafts of themes, so initial interpretations of what's going on. And as you can see, the following phases after that really focus on piecing that story together. So refining, regrouping, explaining the themes in a way that ultimately answers your research question. And it's important to note here, as phase 6 indicates, that writing up is still an important part of the analysis process, because our thinking often develops further as we write. So I would also recommend taking lots of notes and writing down your reflections and observations as you work on the themes, as that's really useful. So to give you an example of what a theme might be as a result of thematic analysis, here's a study from my PhD examining what parents of preschoolers in Soweto think about their children's movement and dietary behaviors. So one of the themes I developed was called Aspirations and Pressures of Parenthood, relating to food and the food environment. And it's exemplified by this quote from one of the mothers that I interviewed in this study, who said, "We have a debonair's just next to us. Imagine the child passing by with a box of pizza here, and then this one, her daughter, she's sitting at the gate. Mommy doesn't buy me that. She's always making me eat carrots and all those things. Can you imagine the pressure?" For more examples and perhaps more sophisticated and advanced examples of really the kind of things that thematic analysis can allow you to do, I would really recommend you to visit this website. And like I said, I'll share this afterwards. It's a website run by Brown and Clark themselves, where they have shared lots of papers, books that they've written, either their own papers or papers that other people have written using thematic analysis, and any other resources really that you could think of wanting to know about in relation to reflexive thematic analysis. So I would recommend visiting that. And they do have a new book coming out specifically focusing on thematic analysis in November 2021. So I'm looking forward to that. Then I thought we could go through some of the pros and cons of using thematic analysis. And firstly, I would say a big advantage of reflexive thematic analysis is that it's so widely used and well described, as indicated by the resources shared. So it's possibly the most commonly used qualitative analysis method, but at least among the most commonly used ones. But this then also means that the quality of published examples varies because there's so many out there. So that's why I wanted to guide you to those resources put together by Brown and Clark, because you can get a kind of recommended reading list rather than just finding any study that has used this, because it may not be exactly what you're looking for. So the specific steps to follow are quite straightforward and make it beginner friendly. But then again, it also creates this impression of it being quite easy to just do thematic analysis. And that's why it's very important to consider, if we're just doing thematic analysis, what are we actually doing, with what kind of assumptions, within what theoretical orientation or philosophical paradigm. And so whether you're familiar with David and Moira Rose from the show Schitt's Creek or not, you can just imagine a team of researchers starting thematic analysis, and for example here, illustrated by this meme around coding the data. If they haven't agreed on what exactly they're doing, or if they're not quite clear on the key terminology, it might be quite a challenge if you just code the data or just try to do something without really knowing what it is. So definitely lots of decisions to be made. And that's why it's important to do some of those background readings that Brown and Clark have helpfully shared, as it aids this kind of decision making. But definitely a bonus is that it's so versatile. So it can be used for almost any topic by anyone. And if you're not sure about that, there's actually a paper written by Brown and Clark called "Can I use thematic analysis? Should I use thematic analysis? Should I not use thematic analysis?" which helps to think about that kind of decision making specifically. So I would definitely look that up, and I'll share it in the list. But then this versatility is also a bit of a challenge, since there are so many decisions to be made. So for example, what level of depth or nuance we're going for with the analysis. And I find this quote from Brown and Clark illustrative of some of the diversity in using reflexive thematic analysis. So they say here that the version of thematic analysis we've developed provides a robust, systematic framework for coding qualitative data, and for then using that coding to identify patterns across the data set in relation to the research question. The questions of what level patterns are sought at and what interpretations are made of those patterns are left to the researcher. This is because the techniques are separate from the theoretical orientation of the research. And that brings us to this idea of big Q versus little q qualitative research. So thinking about whether we're using qualitative methods while following a fully developed qualitative framework or paradigm, so that would be big Q qualitative research, or are we using qualitative methods like interviews and thematic analysis, for example, in the context of a predominantly quantitative or positivist framework. So for example, in mixed method studies, this could be the case, and that would be then small Q qualitative research, where we're more interested in descriptive findings rather than exploring or uncovering phenomenon in a very sophisticated, in-depth kind of way. And this is actually not always easy to define or determine, but I encourage reflections and discussion around this. So there's definitely pros and cons to thematic analysis, but it remains a novice-friendly option that I recommend looking into for a wide range of qualitative work. Then from the point of view of someone who reviews manuscripts where thematic analysis is cited, as the method of qualitative analysis, I have some observations and recommendations. And one is the typical challenge of non-analysis, where the themes are not fully developed, but more just topics or what Brown and Clark call domain summaries that do reflect the data, but perhaps they were already defined in the interview guide. So it could be things like barriers to physical activity or definition of health. And if the aim is being descriptive, that should be made clear. So themes that match interview guide questions are not really the result of analysis. And then the method's description should reflect this clearly. And of course, people will be talking about barriers to physical activity if you ask them about that. But then the theme itself does not really tell us what they're saying about those barriers, in contrast to a theme like maybe avoiding exercise due to crime and traffic. Then another pet peeve of mine and many others who use thematic analysis is themes emerged or any variation of that. And this has been critiqued by Brown and Clark and others. But my main response here is that analysis is not magic, and therefore nothing appears or emerges through magic. So the researchers doing the analysis can, for example, develop themes, or they can generate themes, but not discover, because themes are not hiding in the data waiting to be discovered or waiting to emerge. And that's why transparency in reporting qualitative research, especially anything that claims to be reflexive, is often about acknowledging the active role of the researcher. And this is a reality of qualitative research and not a shortcoming, even though some people may claim that. And I'm not making these points to shame anyone or anyone's practice, but I find reflections around these aspects to really take us forward in terms of intentional, transparent practice in qualitative health research. And that's why I wanted to raise them. And with all that in mind, I want to leave you with a few key points here. So firstly, purposes vary, and therefore methods, paradigms, and outputs of qualitative research vary. And decisions should be made according to what we want to achieve. And reflexive thematic analysis or other thematic analysis approaches can accommodate almost any kind of combinations of those things. But the challenge is for researchers to figure out what they're doing and why, and ensuring consistency and coherence of such decisions. And asking for more transparent and comprehensive reporting about methods is my most common feedback as a peer reviewer. So how could I even comment on findings if I'm not really sure what the study is trying to achieve, how and why? So that's why my advice is to do what you say and say what you did. And if ever you're not sure about what you're doing or what you should be doing or how to describe it, I can more or less guarantee that Brown and Clark's website will help guide you. So have a look at that. And also, it's always good to discuss with colleagues. So by engaging with other qualitative researchers, we can keep learning and advancing our practice. So thank you from me, and over to you, Justin.
I now will hand over to and firstly introduce Dr. Edna Bosari, who is a postdoc research scientist at Georgetown University, the Center for Innovation in Global Health, and the Kamuzu University of Health Sciences in Malawi. Edna is also a researcher at the WITS Development Pathways to Health Research Unit.
Yeah, thank you so much. And thank you, Sonia, for the first presentation on reflexive thematic analysis. My presentation will touch on grounded theory approach. And as Sonia mentioned, like thematic analysis is analysis that is commonly used. Most people find it like easier to use or to engage with compared to like grounded theory approach. Grounded theory approach, some people really find it somehow difficult or find it a bit complicated or even confusing. And this motivates me to talk about it because I've used it in my research. And I mean, just talking about it, I hope to inspire others to also engage with this theory. So just to begin, you will wonder, what is this grounded theory about? I mean, what is this grounded theory and why would I encourage researchers to use it? So just to begin with, this theory was developed in the 1967 by Glaser and Strauss. These are sociologists. And their aim was to try and understand patterns and behavior in people in the community. And the aim of coming up with this grounded theory was to try and construct or develop or build theory from data. Most of the time as researchers, we go out to the field, collect data, analyze and present, but their idea was maybe we can do it, we can go further, because a lot of times you find qualitative researchers were seen to be like not like the methods were not regarded so seriously. So they thought if we can come up with a framework that will even build on what qualitative researchers does, not just stopping at data collection and presentation, but going further to develop a theory might even be a better way of expressing how we conduct our studies. But since 1967, the theory has evolved. I have really very limited time. I won't talk about all the genealogy of the evolution of this theory, but we find that it has evolved. A lot of editions have taken place from the proponents themselves, Glaser and Strauss. Others have questioned the theory, have criticized the theory, have even built the theory further. So a lot of things have happened on this theory, and sometimes this is why there are confusions. Researchers sometimes tend not to understand, how do I even use this theory? Am I even doing the right thing? So as I mentioned, from the issue of understanding human behavior, it's evolved even to include issues to do with symbolic interactions. When you are in the field collecting data, you want to understand, how do people use knowledge? How do people use language to try and express their interactions? Then later we have Professor Kathy Sharma came up with what we call constructive grounded theory, which tries to show how do participants and researchers participate in the construction of knowledge. So Sharma was trying to argue that it's not all about you as a researcher collecting data, analyzing and presenting, but you have a key role in terms of knowledge production, including the people you are interviewing in the field. They help you. So both you and the participant, you co-create. You really have a role that you play in co-creating this knowledge. And those are some of the key tenets of grounded theory that has to be really captured. And some people have wondered, is this a theory or is it a method? So this is another thing that has been a bit confusing. I will say it's both a method and a theory. As a method, it provides us with guidelines on how to identify categories in data, link these categories to make sense. Again, it can be seen, it is actually a theory because it's the end product of these processes. As the end product, then it gives us with conceptual ideas or frameworks on how we interpret the phenomenon under study. But remember, as Sonia mentioned earlier on thematic analysis, reflexivity is very key in grounded theory because you don't have to go in and interpret things the way you see them from your own perceptions, but you need to really be grounded in the data, interpret things as they are, as people talk about, and not what you think. So briefly, I'll take you through the grounded theory processes, and this is something that people or researchers find to be hectic. So the first thing is you have to collect your data, and you have your different data sources. On my left, you have data from observation, transcripts, and whatnot. So once you have your data, you move to what we call open coding. This open coding is where you create ideas, you create broad concepts on your data or about your data. And at this basic, the first step of coding or trying to understand what the data is all about, you might identify gaps, things that you really never you never purposed to collect in the first stage of data collection, but you might identify things that you think they are really important. And this might prompt you to go back to the field and fill these gaps, or even revise your tools, revise your questions to try and capture these new insights. And that is what we call theoretical sampling in grounded theory approach. So you have to go back, collect more data. So it's a kind of back and forth process. And there's what we call constant comparison. You keep on comparing your broad themes with the data. So there's comparing code, and also you compare code and new data. So it's a back and forth process that keeps you really engaged with your data, and it helps you to move forward when you really address some of the key gaps. And during the open coding, Sonia mentioned about writing notes on how you are developing your codes, how you are doing your analysis. This is what we call memoing. Memoing is very, very important in grounded theory, because at the end of the day, if you develop a theory without explaining the processes, then your theory will be too superficial and it will lack that kind of originality. So from open coding, we move to axial coding. And axial coding, this is where you start identifying patterns. Remember, the first time you just had your different categories, broad categories. So you start identifying patterns. What is the relationship between code A and code B? You try to see whether there is a sequence. And after axial coding, you move to selective coding. And this is where then you identify the key themes for analysis. This is the place, it actually elevates you higher in terms of analysis. So you are no longer going back to the field, but now you are making sense of your data to see what is the storyline. So when you have your storyline, you have your key ideas, including your theoretical framing or coding, then you come up with grounded theory. So having talked about this, you can, as I mentioned during the evolution, there are so many myths about this grounded theory, and people sometimes feel confused, including even experienced researchers. Sometimes they feel confused, but this is my stand on this grounded theory. So there are myths, and these myths are some of what I'm going to talk about, just a few of them. So myth number one, researchers, and including the classical proponents of this theory, they said that you should not be influenced by literature. So initially it was aimed, grounded theory aimed that you go to the field, collect data without really doing literature review. Once you collect your data, you present, you have your analysis, then you can go and engage with the literature. And this is something that really I will dispute, because I think you just have to engage with the literature, but you have to know, you have to make a conscious decision. Like you have to try and not be influenced by literature, but you need to engage with literature. You need to have to identify gaps. How do I identify gaps for research if you don't engage with literature? So literature review is important. Another thing with the current progress in research world and everywhere, if you are applying for funding, or if you are submitting a piece of work for ethical review or institutional review boards, they will not take your work seriously without literature review. So literature review is very important. And another thing, if you work on your data and finish with literature, it means that your literature review is going to be really narrow and focused on your key themes only. So another myth is that data collection and analysis happen concurrently. I talked about this when I said you have to go back and forth. So this largely happens with grounded theory and many other qualitative data collection and analysis method. But this is not like it's a must. It's not something that you have to do it, or if you don't do it, then you're doing something else. Remember, your research is influenced by many other factors, depending on your research design, depending on how the tools you are using. And sometimes we have people do group research. So in that sense, you can never put everybody in the same context to say, now we are moving from a data analysis, from data collection to analysis. So it depends with your research design and many other factors. So this should not really push you away from engaging with grounded theory. Another thing that most researchers believe is that coding and analysis is time consuming. Remember, I showed you the different processes. I will argue that I don't agree with this point, because all data collection and analysis methods, including quantitative methods, there's nothing that is really a shortcut. Everything takes some time. And for grounded theory, I feel like the process, it has more pros compared to cons. And for me, it's not about a waste of time, but it's an opportunity for you to engage further with data and also familiarize with yourself with what is happening, even before you come up with the conclusions and interpretation of your data. Then lastly, the last myth is that grounded theory must produce a theory. Remember when I showed you the process, at the end, we see a theory being produced. And these statements can be quite intimidating, especially to new researchers or people who are inexperienced in using this kind of approach. So grounded theory, truly, yeah, people like researchers are encouraged to go through the whole process and come up with a theory. But for me, I will take it like I explained initially, it can be a method and it can also be a theory as the end product. So if you want to use it as a method, you can use the different tenets of grounded theory to engage with your data, to systematically, analyze your work and present it without necessarily coming up with a theory. So this one, I also, dispel this kind of myth. And I've done this before in part of my work, some of the work that I've done in Soweto, I've sent my work out for publication, and you find reviewers telling me, if you use a grounded theory, then you need to show us the theory that you developed. And I've argued my case. So I just pulled up the data analysis part, where I argue that, yeah, indeed, I used a grounded theory approach, but the main aim here was not to generate a new theory, but to use the different tenets of grounded theory to develop systematic, iterative, and reflexive process of my data analysis. So having talked about that, I don't mean to shortchange the grounded theory. Grounded theory is a very, very important theory. It's a very good, I like it actually. I use it in most of my work, and I will encourage others to use it. And these are the key principles if you want to use grounded theory. Number one, you have to take the word grounded seriously, from the word itself, grounded seriously. This means that as researchers, you must remain open to new or unanticipated findings. Don't go into data with your own preconceptions, or we are not testing hypotheses. If you are testing hypotheses, grounded theory is not a theory for you. This is a theory that you have to be reflexive, you have to be open and look for new ideas or information that will be interesting. Then another thing is that research context is key. Remember, we are not just collecting data and analyzing without talking about the context. Try to seek clarifications about how the context influence your research, how people's social settings, how the economic activities, the political, behaviors in that community where you are collecting data, how does it influence your findings? So this is an important aspect of grounded theory. Remember, you have to engage with the data as close as possible by, doing constant comparison method that I talked about. Then lastly, theoretical sampling is very important for grounded theory. Theoretical sampling is where you identify gaps, go back to the field to fill those gaps. And I've also done this from my own experience in Soweto. I did ethnographic work in a hospital setting, and my initial plan was to go direct to the diabetes endocrine clinic because I do a lot of study on HIV and diabetes patients. So I went to the diabetes endocrine clinic where I put my cursor here. But after staying in this clinic for 4 to 5 months, I realized that there were gaps in my data. So I realized that patients were not coming directly to the diabetes endocrine clinic, but they were starting from the medical outpatient clinic. So in my design, I never thought medical outpatient clinic was going to be important for my study. So I had to sit down with my supervisors and redesigned my study. So I went back to start with the medical outpatient clinic, follow the pathway. So this is one of my papers that you might find interesting to see how, researchers, you can be forced to go back and fill those gaps. And for me, this is important so that you don't rush into analyzing and presenting your data without filling those gaps. Those gaps are very important. They help you to, to present things as they are. And that's why you have to be grounded to your data and to your context. So some of the key considerations: understand your research questions is very important. Not all studies will take a grounded theory approach. So if you're interested in grounded theory, ensure that you understand your research questions and determine if grounded theory corresponds to your ontological and epistemological position. Note that grounded theory can produce large amount of data. Remember, you are going back and forth, and this can often become difficult to manage this data. So you need some orientation even before you use a grounded theory approach. You need some guidance, engage with others who've used this theory, and then you learn how to make judgment on when to move from one step to another, when to move from data collection to analysis and to presentation. Without much further ado, I'll stop there. These are part of the reading resources, and I hope to engage further in discussions. Thank you so much. Over to you, Justin.
Many thanks, Edna, for that very in-depth and comprehensive presentation. It is welcomed. And I think at this stage, I will go through the questions, and I will also request of the presenters and also the panelists.
In terms of different types, it's obviously difficult to say exactly this will fit this, and this is the correct way to make this decision. But I raised the kind of descriptive versus analytical dichotomy there a little bit as a placeholder, I guess, also for inductive and deductive approaches. So there's lots of different ways to classify thematic analysis, or reflect even within reflexive thematic analysis. So I think one quite useful way of looking at it is maybe also this kind of difference between Edna and myself, that Edna is a medical anthropologist who does very in-depth, very nuanced, very grounded research. And I actually do, I think, a bit more descriptive and pragmatic orientated research. So I'm interested in process analysis, for example, and a lot of my research is somehow adjacent to intervention. So either kind of formative work that aims to inform interventions, or process evaluations would be kind of alongside interventions. So I think that might be a helpful way to look at that. That if the purpose is very specific and actually quite practical, then probably we're leaning more towards the descriptive end of what I assume to be a spectrum or continuum. And then if we're really exploring social phenomena in an in-depth kind of way, which thematic analysis does allow, I just personally am more of an applied health researcher with a bit of a mixed background. So I think that comes in. So I hope I don't know if that's helpful to distinguish. I don't know if Kathy or Edna, do you have something to add for that kind of general direction?
Yeah, just to briefly add, I think it is really hard to fit certain types of studies and certain types of qualitative research into kind of neat boxes. Similar to Sonia, I work in quite a lot of mixed method studies and a lot to do with interventions, and so often there are kind of quite clear research questions that we want to ask about, or certain processes or certain issues that we want to cover, and I kind of try and get a bit of a blend of the inductive versus the deductive, so that you have some kind of structure, but then room to kind of explore other issues that do come up in the discussion, or that kind of provide more of a context. So so I think it is good to kind of have a bit of a blend. And I know my kind of early research and qualitative work was very kind of narrative based, and just kind of threw out a blank page and allowed participants to kind of tell their story, and then saw what came out of that. So, but I find in a lot of health research there is a bit more of a pragmatic leaning.
Deductive and inductive are actually part of grounded theory, and we use them in different other qualitative methods. So when you talk about deductive, remember I talked about engaging with literature. So you read broad literature and you develop your research questions. So those research questions can guide you on how you start approaching your data analysis and categorization. So you have your questions. For example, if you ask someone, what kind of foods do you eat, or where do you live? So definitely people are going to talk about those specific elements. So you have already that in mind, that you have these things that you asked, and you're going to get responses on this. That is deductive approach. You deduce, you come up with codes from your literature and your research questions. Inductively, it's from grounded, what I talked about. You induct, you get engaged into the data. These are things that you never ask the respondents or your subjects or participants, but they emerge from the data. This is what we call inductive coding. You start engaging from the data, new things, new insights that you never asked about. So that is the difference between deductive and inductive approaches. So remember, when you are collecting this data, if possible, it's good to engage with participants. As you make sense of your data, don't wait till the end of data collection. From the beginning, engage with these participants. When you collect data, for example, if you're interviewing somebody, when you finish, just try to read the key ideas that came up from that interview, and let them say whether that is exactly how it is, or whether you misinterpreted the conversation. After that, when you move to data coding and analysis, you come up with key themes, go back to the participants and also tell them what you found from the different, interviews or from the narratives that you did. So you have to move along with them from every step so that you don't just shock them when you come up with a kind of, especially if you are using a framework that is not familiar to participants, they won't understand how you ended up with these key findings. So what I do mostly is to engage them consecutively from data collection to analysis. Thank you. Yes, you can use grounded theory, and even after having been informed by a particular theoretical framework, that's possible.
Just to reiterate what the other presenters have said, is that it's really important to kind of be thoughtful and intentional about the different methods you use, not just from data collection, but in terms of analysis as well. And thinking about analysis sooner rather than later, I think really helps you then make better decisions about the kind of data that you'll collect. And each project is different, each context is different. So yeah, and I think having other colleagues to bounce ideas off and to learn from is really crucial.
Yeah, I have a very short answer to the first question of whether we use Saldana's coding methods. So no, I have not used that. And it sounds somehow familiar and the description sounds really interesting. So I'll definitely look into it. But it did remind me of another thing I was going to say, partly in response to also the questions around different types of thematic analysis. And that's that there's a pretty recent, really interesting paper that I'll also put on that list of resources, which is about realist thematic analysis, because that's a direction I've started going into, the research using realist methods and approaches. So there's a paper by Gareth Wiltshire and Noora Ronkainen, who have written on realist thematic analysis. And so they've conceptualized different types of themes, or kind of categories of themes. So experiential themes, inferential themes, and dispositional themes. And that reflects this kind of three-layered ontological kind of structure of the world according to realist research. And it'll make sense if you look into it. I don't want to go into it in a lot of details now, but I like the idea of exploring kind of different coding types and also different types of themes. And I think that paper, even if you're not interested in realist research per se, I think it's a really useful paper to think through some of those, like I was talking about, the decisions along the way, and really being intentional and transparent about ontological, epistemological assumptions and kind of your position in those types of ways.